The gold pocket watch felt heavier in John's weathered hands than it had in years. Sitting alone in his den, the silence of an empty house wrapped around him like an unfamiliar coat. 3 days since Melissa had taken the grandkids to the beach, a trip he'd been subtly discouraged from joining. The familiar tick-tick-tick of the family heirloom seemed to count down to something he couldn't name. A strange car in the driveway yesterday, according to Robert next door. Probably nothing, his neighbor had said, not quite meeting John's eyes. But these days, might be worth putting in some cameras. For security. John's thumb traced the worn engraving on the watch case, a gift from his father when he'd turned 18. Back when truths seemed simpler, when a man's word and a woman's promise formed foundations you could build decades upon. A tear, unexpected and unwelcome, blurred his vision. Something wasn't right. After 40 years of marriage, you develop a sense for these things, like the way he could diagnose an engine problem from the slightest irregular sound. Has betrayal ever blindsided you? Share your story below, like if this resonates, follow to see how John uncovers the painful truth. Setting the watch down, John opened his laptop. Security cameras. Just a precaution, he told himself. Just to be sure. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating at the threshold of a door he feared couldn't be closed once opened. Outside, dusk gathered like a bruise across the neighborhood where he'd spent his entire married life. Inside, the foundations of that life trembled beneath him, unnoticed by anyone but him. John eased into his den, the familiar creak of floorboards beneath his feet, both comfort and companion in the empty house. 3 days since Melissa had taken the kids to the beach, and the silence had been a blessing. Until now. The letter lay on his desk where he'd dropped the mail, but something about it caught his eye. The return address smudged, the handwriting almost right, but not quite. His fingers trembled as he reached for it. 42 years as a mechanic had trained his eye to spot when things didn't fit, when tolerances were off by fractions. The same instinct now sent a cold trickle down his spine. "Can't be right," he murmured, the words hanging in the dust motes dancing through late afternoon sunlight. The grandfather clock in the hall marked time with merciless precision. He lowered himself into the leather chair, the one Melissa had insisted was too expensive 20 years ago. The paper crinkled as he opened it, the sound unnaturally loud. His eyes scanned the words, widened, then blurred with sudden moisture. Not from them. Can't be. A memory surfaced. Sunday dinners with the grandkids, Melissa's hand on his shoulder, laughter filling every corner of this room. Now the same space felt hollow, the coffee cooling on his desk, bitter in his nostrils. His chest tightened. The first sob caught him by surprise, lodged somewhere between heart and throat. He pressed his hand against his sternum, feeling the thunder of his pulse beneath weathered skin. The family portrait on his desk, taken last Christmas, watched him with frozen smiles. His fingers traced the faces of his grandchildren, remembering how little Emma had climbed into his lap afterward, declaring, "Grandpa fixes everything." The memory now twisted like a knife. John shook his head slowly, a tear breaking free to chart a course down his lined cheek. The letter trembled in his grip, the words swimming before him. He'd built a life with careful hands, with precision and patience. How could the foundation shift so suddenly beneath him? "How could you, darlin'?" His shoulders curved inward as a second sob escaped, this one deeper, pulled from somewhere beneath his ribs. The silence of the house amplified his grief, sent it echoing back to him from walls that had witnessed 4 decades of his marriage. When the tears subsided enough to clear his vision, John noticed something he'd missed. A smudge on the signature, a carelessness that didn't match the careful forgery of the rest. His mechanic's eye, the one that had spotted hairline cracks in engine blocks and imperfections invisible to others, narrowed. Suspicion sparked where grief had burned. He straightened slowly in his chair, wiping his face with a handkerchief that had been his father's. The ache remained, but something else took shape beside it, a determination as familiar as the tools that had defined his working life. A soft knock at the front door startled him. John folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket close to his heart. His steps faltered toward the sound, the floorboards announcing his approach like old friends sharing a secret. John paused at the door, tucking away his handkerchief and running a palm across his face. Couldn't have visitors seeing him like this, a grown man with tear tracks down his weathered cheeks. He squared his shoulders, the letter a weighted presence against his chest. "Coming," he called, voice steadier than he felt. Robert Chambers stood on the porch, pipe clenched between his teeth, gray eyebrows raised in greeting. 20 years as neighbors had made formalities unnecessary. "Evening, John. Thought I'd check in. Place gets quiet when they're away, don't it?" John nodded, stepping back to let his neighbor in. "Coffee's still warm, if you want some." "Sounds good," Robert said, removing his pipe. His sharp eyes took in John's reddened eyes, but mercifully asked no questions. They settled at the kitchen table, mugs steaming between them. John's hands curled around the ceramic, seeking warmth that wouldn't come. "You all right there, old friend?" Robert finally asked, breaking the fragile silence. "I'm fine. Just fine." The words stuck in his throat. "Been better," John admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. His fingers twitched toward his pocket where the letter lay. Robert nodded slowly, tapping his pipe against his palm. "Noticed something peculiar the other day. Didn't know whether to mention it." John's head lifted, a spark of alertness cutting through his fog. "What's that?" "Car in your driveway Tuesday afternoon. Thought you might have had company, but—" Robert trailed off, eyes fixed on the tabletop. "Wasn't anyone I recognized." A cold weight settled in John's stomach. Tuesday. He'd been at his daughter Sarah's place, helping with shelving. Melissa had said she was meeting her sister for lunch. "You sure about that?" John asked, voice dropping to a near whisper. Robert nodded, discomfort evident in the way he shifted. Didn't think much of it. "Folks have visitors." John's mind flashed to the letter in his pocket. The timing couldn't be coincidence. His mechanic's mind, the one that had diagnosed countless problems by connecting seemingly unrelated symptoms, began assembling pieces. "You ever—" John started, then faltered. The words felt like betrayal themselves. "You ever worry about Marion when you were working those long hauls?" Robert's expression softened with understanding. "John, I don't like to speak ill, but—" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You might consider getting some cameras. For security, you understand. Lot of break-ins these days." The suggestion hung between them, its true meaning clear in Robert's careful avoidance of John's eyes. "Security," John repeated, the word hollow. "Simple ones from the hardware store. Record to your computer." Robert sipped his coffee. "Peace of mind is all." John nodded slowly, a flush of shame heating his neck. Was he really considering spying on his wife of 40 years? A flash of memory. Melissa's secretive phone calls these past months, the weekend trips with the grandkids that always seemed to come when he mentioned joining them, the letter now burning in his pocket. "Might do that," John said, voice steadier than before. The betrayal of trust cut both ways, it seemed. After Robert left, John stood at the kitchen window, watching darkness settle over the neighborhood where he'd built his life. The house creaked around him, a sound he'd always found comforting until now. His hands no longer shook as he pulled out his laptop, typing home security cameras into the search bar. The betrayal of 40 years deserved certainty, at least. Evening settled over the garden like a weighted blanket. John lowered himself onto the wooden bench, feeling every one of his 67 years in the protest of his joints. 3 days had passed since Robert's visit, and the cameras had arrived that morning. Small, inconspicuous things that promised truth where doubt now festered. He turned the cryptic note over in his hands, the paper soft from repeated handling. The words hadn't changed, yet each reading revealed new layers of deception. The forged signature, Melissa's sister's name, had been clever, but not perfect. Too many loops in the why, the slant all wrong. "Who taught you to lie, darlin'?" he whispered to the dusk. Rose scent drifted from Melissa's prized bushes, the ones he'd helped plant on their 30th anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd dug the holes together, her laughter when he'd gotten mud on his nose still clear in his memory. Had she been faithful then? When had it started? A sob caught him unawares, escaping before he could trap it behind clenched teeth. He bent forward, elbows on knees, the note crumpling in his grip. 40 years, he murmured. 40 years and 3 children and 6 grandkids. John had never considered himself an important man, just a mechanic with grease-stained hands who'd built a modest life. He'd fixed cars and appliances, coached Little League, saved for college funds, the kind of man whose worth was measured in reliability rather than excitement. Was that it? Had he become as predictable and uninteresting as an old clock? The thought brought fresh pain, a tightness around his heart that had nothing to do with his age and everything to do with feeling suddenly irrelevant in his own life. The cameras waited inside, still in their packaging on the kitchen table. Part of him wanted to throw them away, to retreat into comfortable ignorance. But the mechanic in him, the man who'd spent a lifetime finding and fixing problems, couldn't leave this diagnostic unfinished. He unfolded the note again, squinting in the fading light. Something about the phrasing bothered him. Meeting canceled, taking the kids longer. It matched Melissa's pattern of speech, but the underlying message felt wrong, manufactured. This wasn't just about the note anymore. Robert's sighting, the secretive phone calls, the way Melissa's eyes slid away from his when discussing her plans. Like a series of warning lights on a dashboard, each small on its own, but concerning in combination. Night chill settled around him as stars emerged overhead. The same stars they'd watched on camping trips with the kids. The same sky under which they'd built their life together. "Tell me I'm wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking on the last word. "Please let me be wrong about this." A rustling sound from the bushes near the fence startled him. John straightened, suddenly alert, eyes narrowing at the shadows. "Someone there?" he called, rising to his feet. The only answer was the soft sigh of wind through leaves and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Still, the hair on the back of his neck stood up, the feeling of being watched, of something important happening just beyond his awareness, wouldn't leave him. Inside, the house waited with its empty rooms and hidden cameras still uninstalled. Melissa would return tomorrow with the grandchildren, her voice filling the spaces that now echoed with his solitary footsteps. John tucked the note into his pocket and straightened his shoulders. The answers would come soon enough. The truth always emerged eventually. He'd learned that much from decades of diagnosing mechanical problems. The trick was being ready for what you found. As he stepped back toward the house, resolve hardened within him like cooling metal. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same steady hands that had rebuilt engines and repaired the broken things of the world. Something moved again in his peripheral vision, a shadow sliding behind the garden shed. This time, John was certain it wasn't the wind. The attic air hung thick with dust and memory. John hunched beneath the sloped ceiling, the single bare bulb casting harsh shadows that seemed to pulse with each beat of his hammering heart. 3 weeks had passed since he'd installed the cameras, simple ones at first, just as Robert had suggested. Now the evidence lay scattered around him, undeniable in its brutal clarity. Why? The word tore from his throat, raw and primal. Why you? His fingers trembled as he spread the printouts across the ancient trunk that held Christmas decorations and baby clothes they'd never been able to part with. Each image told part of a story he'd never imagined reading. A strange car in the driveway, a man at the door, Melissa's smile, different somehow from the one she offered him, and finally, the two of them disappearing upstairs. The timestamps formed a pattern, always when John was at his weekly veterans lunch or helping Sarah with her house renovations. The first time he'd seen the footage, he'd vomited in the bathroom sink, heaving until nothing remained but bitter bile and 40 years of trust circling the drain. 40 years, he whispered, his voice a ghost in the stifling space. A sob tore through him, this one different from the quiet grief of uncertainty. This was rage and humiliation, a visceral pain that bent him double. He slammed his fist against the trunk, welcoming the physical sting that briefly eclipsed his emotional agony. His wedding ring caught the light as he reached for another printout. The gold band had worn thin over decades, just as their marriage had apparently worn thin without his knowledge. He twisted it, a habit from whenever he was deep in thought about a particularly troublesome repair job. Should have seen it, he growled, anger turning inward. Signs were all there. John had always prided himself on his diagnostic abilities. Cars, appliances, even the neighborhood kids' bicycles. He could spot what was wrong, what was out of alignment, what needed fixing. But he'd missed this, the most important diagnosis of his life. The attic floorboards creaked beneath him as he shifted, the sound a reminder of the home they'd built together. Every corner held memories, the height marks on the kitchen door frame, the dent in the living room wall from their son's overly enthusiastic baseball practice, the garden bench where he'd proposed a second time on their 25th anniversary. Now those memories were tainted, overlaid with questions about what else had been happening while he fixed cars and played with grandchildren. John reached for the new equipment he'd purchased 3 days ago. Cameras with audio capability, higher resolution, better night vision, more expensive than the first set, but he needed to be certain. Needed to hear as well as see. No more guessing, he muttered, checking the battery indicator on one of the devices. Footsteps on the stairs below froze him in place. Melissa's voice drifted up, calling his name. In the 3 weeks since her return, he'd maintained a facade of normalcy that cost him more each day. Every kiss good morning felt like swallowing glass. Every, how was your day, was a test of his resolve. In the attic, he called back, his voice steadier than he felt. Just looking for my old fishing tackle. He quickly gathered the printouts, sliding them into a folder he tucked beneath a box of old tax returns. The new cameras he hid inside his toolbox, the one place Melissa never looked. When her head appeared through the attic hatch, he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her own smile easy and unburdened. "Sarah called. They're coming over Sunday with the kids." John nodded, wondering if the man would be in their bed on Saturday while he visited his brother upstate, a trip Melissa had unexpectedly encouraged last week. "Be right down," he replied, amazed at how normal he sounded while breaking apart inside. After she descended, John remained motionless, listening to her footsteps fade toward the kitchen. The rage that had consumed him minutes ago hardened into something colder, more calculated. The mechanic's mind that had solved countless puzzles now turned to a different kind of problem. He would install the new cameras tonight while she slept. He would document every instance, build an irrefutable case. No confrontation yet. Not until he had everything he needed. A tear tracked through the dust on his cheek as he gazed at a faded photograph tucked in the corner of the trunk. Their wedding day, both so young and certain of the future they'd build. "Should have seen it coming," he whispered, closing the trunk on both the photograph and a chapter of his life. Won't miss the signs again. The bulb flickered overhead as if in agreement, casting strange shadows that seemed to nod with him in the gathering darkness. Russet leaves skittered across the empty park bench as John lowered himself onto the cold wooden slats. The chatter of distant children playing seemed to come from another world entirely, one where trust remained unbroken and families weren't quietly imploding from within. 6 weeks of surveillance had yielded more evidence than his heart could bear. The advanced cameras had captured everything, whispered endearments never spoken to him, promises made in his own bedroom, plans discussed in his absence. The man, James, he'd learned, was younger by at least 15 years. An architect Melissa had met through her volunteer work at the community center. John's hands trembled as he withdrew the latest printout from his coat pocket. He'd been so careful, methodical in his documentation. The retired mechanic, applying the precision of his craft to the disassembly of his marriage. But today, the evidence had slipped through his fingers at the worst possible moment. "Should have been more careful," he whispered, his breath fogging in the autumn air. He'd left the folder on his workbench while going to answer the phone. Sarah calling about Thanksgiving plans, of all things. When he'd returned, Melissa had been standing there, his annotated timeline of her betrayal spread before her. Her face. He would never forget her face. Not the shame he'd expected, but cold anger. Accusations had followed. Invasion of privacy, paranoia, controlling behavior. She'd stormed out, folder in hand, evidence disappearing with her. 40 years, he murmured to the empty park. 40 years, and she made me the villain. The wind picked up, cutting through his jacket and chilling the tears on his cheeks. He hadn't bothered to wipe them away. What was the point? No one was here to see an old man cry. A jogger passed, giving him a wide berth and a concerned glance. John wondered what he saw. Just another elderly man alone on a bench, invisible in his ordinariness. Or could strangers sense the collapse occurring within him, the foundations of his life crumbling in real time? Without the evidence, his case felt suddenly hollow. Her words had planted seeds of doubt. Was he paranoid? Had age and insecurity twisted his perceptions? No. He'd seen the footage, heard the words. He wasn't imagining the betrayal. The folder contained everything. Dates, times, transcribed conversations, months of work, gone. His leverage, his proof, his validation, all disappeared with her angry departure. "Lost it all," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Everything." For the first time since discovering the affair, despair overwhelmed him completely. The careful control he'd maintained, the methodical approach to his pain. It all cracked open like an engine block frozen and thawed once too often. A sob tore from his chest, then another, until he was bent forward on the bench, face buried in calloused hands that had built and fixed and held and loved for decades. Hands that now seemed useless against this particular breakdown. Betrayal hit hard. Share your pain, like for strength, follow for hope. Can he rebuild trust? An older woman walking her small dog slowed as she passed, her concerned gaze lingering on his shaking shoulders. John straightened, embarrassment burning through his grief. Men of his generation didn't fall apart in public. "You all right there?" she asked, her voice gentle with the universal tone used for wounded creatures. John nodded stiffly, unable to explain that nothing would be all right again, that his life had collapsed into before and after, that he was mourning not just his marriage but his perception of his entire life. As she moved on, John's phone buzzed in his pocket. He withdrew it with numb fingers, expecting Melissa's name. Instead, Robert's appeared on the screen, followed by a text message. "Got something you should see. Come by when you can." John stared at the message, uncomprehending at first. Then a spark of something. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. flickered in his chest. Robert had been watching, too. Robert had noticed patterns, had suggested the cameras in the first place. Maybe. John stood on legs weakened by emotion, his knees protesting the movement after sitting tensed for so long. The crisp air filled his lungs as he drew a deep breath, steadying himself against the momentary dizziness. The path stretched before him, leading out of the park toward streets he'd walked for decades. The same route home, but everything changed. He'd entered the park a man trying to save his marriage. He was leaving it a man trying to save himself. His phone buzzed again. "I made copies," Robert's text read. John clutched the device like a lifeline as he turned toward his neighbor's house instead of his own, each step carrying him away from despair and toward whatever came next. A strange car, her car, pulled out from the community center parking lot across from the park. John ducked his head, unwilling to be seen in his current state. As it passed, he caught a glimpse of a male passenger. The sight should have destroyed him further. Instead, it straightened his spine and dried his tears. No more doubts, no more second-guessing. With newfound resolve, John quickened his pace toward Robert's house, leaving the empty park bench behind. The familiar scent of paper and pencil shavings greeted John as he settled into the worn leather chair behind his old desk. Robert had insisted he use the spare room in his house. "Just until you figure things out," he'd said, concern etching deeper lines around his eyes. John had accepted with a gratitude that caught in his throat. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Melissa. 2 weeks of sleeping on Robert's pull-out couch, of avoiding his own home except to collect clothes when he knew she would be out. 2 weeks of rebuilding what had been lost. "Never thought I'd be starting over at 67, John murmured, smoothing the fresh timeline he'd created from Robert's copies. His neighbor had been more observant than John had realized. Not only had Robert made duplicates of the evidence folder before returning it, but he'd also kept his own log of comings and goings at John's house, dates, times, vehicle descriptions. A retired teacher's meticulous record-keeping had preserved what John thought lost forever. A tear slipped down John's cheek, but this one felt different. Not the desperate sob of the park bench, but something cleaner. Pride, perhaps. Pride in friendship. Pride in not being alone. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and returned to organizing the documents. The mechanic's mind that had diagnosed countless automotive failures now hummed with renewed purpose, identifying patterns, connecting evidence, building a case stronger than before. "You'll need a lawyer," Robert had said that morning, placing a business card on the desk. "Gloria Thompson, handled my cousin's divorce. Tough as nails, but fair." The card sat at John's elbow now, a bridge to a future he'd never imagined for himself. Divorced. Single. Starting over when most men his age were settling deeper into the comfort of long marriages. "I'll win," he whispered, the words half prayer, half promise. His fingers, still strong despite arthritis beginning to swell the knuckles, gripped a pen and made another note on the timeline. The familiar action of writing, of creating order from chaos, steadied him. This was what he knew. Breaking down problems into solvable parts, identifying the fault, implementing repairs. Outside the window, autumn was giving way to winter. The first frost had silvered Robert's garden that morning, a reminder that seasons changed whether you were ready or not. John reached for his reading glasses, settling them on his nose as he reviewed financial records he'd gathered from their joint accounts. More patterns emerged. Withdrawals coinciding with her volunteer days, purchases from stores she'd never mentioned visiting. The affair had financial fingerprints as well as emotional ones. A soft knock at the door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called, straightening papers instinctively. Robert entered with 2 steaming mugs, the scent of fresh coffee filling the small room. "Thought you could use this. Been at it for hours." John accepted the mug gratefully, the warmth seeping into hands that had been cold since that day in the park. "Thanks for everything." Robert settled into the chair across the desk, his expression solemn. "Heard from Sarah this morning. Called looking for you." John's heart stuttered. What did she say? That her mother's been telling a different story. That you've lost your mind, gotten paranoid in your old age. Robert's gaze held steady. I set her straight. Told her to come see the evidence herself. A complex emotion washed through John. Grief that Melissa would turn their children against him. Relief that Robert had intervened. Fear of the conversations yet to come. "She coming?" Robert nodded. "Tomorrow afternoon. Said Michael might come too." John's children. His legacy. The thought of them believing him unstable, delusional, cut deeper than Melissa's betrayal in some ways. "They need to hear it from me," he said, straightening. "See it with their own eyes." "They will." Robert's certainty was a balm. "Truth has weight, John. It always finds its level eventually." As Robert left, John turned back to his work with renewed vigor. The prospect of his children's visit tomorrow added urgency to his organization. They would need to understand not just what had happened, but how thoroughly he had verified it. No room for their mother's counter-narrative of a paranoid old man. By evening, the desk was transformed. Where there had been scattered papers, there now stood organized files. Where there had been raw pain, there was now a strategy. The timeline, the financial records, the photographs, the transcripts, all arranged with the precision of an engineer creating blueprints. John sat back, removing his glasses to rub eyes tired from hours of focus. And the work had been therapeutic, each labeled folder and annotated document a small reclamation of control. His gaze fell on a photograph he'd placed at the corner of the desk, not of Melissa, but of his grandchildren at the lake last summer. Their futures were part of this equation too. What happened next would shape their understanding of truth, of consequences, of repair after betrayal. "Won't let you down," he promised their smiling faces. As darkness settled outside, John felt something he hadn't experienced since finding that first letter. Hope, not for reconciliation. That bridge had burned, but for restoration of his dignity, his legacy, his place in his family's story. The path ahead was clear now. Lawyer, divorce, truth, a new chapter written on his terms. For the first time in weeks, John slept without dreams. The courthouse echoed with distant voices, the sound bouncing off marble floors and wooden panels that had witnessed decades of human drama. John straightened his tie, the silky material unfamiliar after years of preferring open collars, and the occasional bolo for special occasions. Today, however, called for formality. "You ready for this?" Gloria Thompson stood beside him, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense demeanor. At 63, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd seen every possible twist in matrimonial law and remained unimpressed by all of them. "As I'll ever be," John replied, his voice steadier than the slight tremor in his hands suggested. The briefcase at his feet contained everything, the evidence meticulously organized, the financial records highlighted and annotated, statements from Robert and 2 other neighbors who'd noticed patterns John himself had been too trusting to see. 3 months of work distilled into documents that would dismantle 40 years of marriage in a matter of hours. A tear threatened at the corner of his eye. John blinked it back, unwilling to show weakness here in this public space. Trust shattered. Comment your fight like for grit, follow for justice. What's his choice? "Having second thoughts?" Gloria asked, her sharp eyes missing nothing. John shook his head. "Not about going forward. Just..." He paused, searching for words. "Remembering when we stood before a judge the first time, wedding day, never imagined standing before one to end it." Gloria's expression softened momentarily. The betrayal isn't yours, John. Remember that. You're reclaiming your dignity, not destroying it. Her words echoed what Sarah had said after seeing the evidence. His daughter's face had crumpled with the realization that her mother had systematically deceived them all, but her words afterward had strengthened John's resolve. Dad, you deserve better. Don't let her make you doubt yourself. Michael had been quieter, more stoic in the face of the revelation, but his hand on John's shoulder had conveyed what words couldn't. Your turn now, John whispered, gathering his courage as the courtroom doors opened. Gloria picked up the briefcase, its weight seemingly nothing in her confident grip. Inside, Melissa already sat with her attorney, a younger man with sharp features and an expensive suit. Her eyes met John's briefly before sliding away, a muscle tightening in her jaw. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the formal setting and the weight of what was to come. For a fleeting moment, John remembered her as she'd been, laughing in their kitchen, flour on her cheek as she taught their children to bake, sleeping peacefully beside him through countless nights, holding his hand through the funeral of his father. 40 years couldn't be erased, even by betrayal. But they could be honored truthfully, and that's what today was about. Truth, consequences, closure. John took his seat beside Gloria, his back straight despite the pressure building in his chest, the familiar sensation of being in over his head, the same feeling he'd had when facing particularly complex engine problems, washed over him. But just as he'd done then, he would break this down into manageable parts, address each component methodically. All rise, came the bailiff's call. As the judge entered, John stood with a dignity that belied his inner turmoil. The proceedings began with formalities, introductions, procedural matters. John answered when spoken to, his voice growing more confident with each response. Then came the moment he'd been preparing for, presenting the evidence. Gloria placed the first document before him, a silent question in her glance. John nodded, ready to speak his truth. Your Honor, he began, the words clear despite the emotion threatening to close his throat. I need to show you why this marriage can't be saved. The folder opened to reveal the first photograph, the first timestamp, the first irrefutable proof. As John spoke, methodically walking through the timeline of discovery and documentation, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if watching himself from a distance. This was the confrontation he'd been building toward, not angry accusations in the heat of betrayal, but calm presentation of facts in the coolness of justice. The mechanic's approach: identify the problem, gather the evidence, implement the solution. Melissa's face changed as he spoke, composure cracking as the weight of documentation mounted. Her attorney leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she shook her head, eyes now fixed on John with an expression he couldn't quite read. The final piece of evidence, the transcribed conversation where she and James had discussed their future plans that had no place for John, lay before the court. John's voice faltered only once in reading it, at the point where Melissa had laughed about his obliviousness. A tear escaped then, tracking silently down his lined cheek. He didn't wipe it away. This tear wasn't weakness. It was acknowledgement of pain, of loss, of a chapter closing. Thank you, Mr. Marshall, the judge said when he finished. We'll take a brief recess before continuing. As the courtroom began to empty, John remained seated, the enormity of what he'd just done washing over him. There would be no going back now, no possibility of pretending, of continuing as before. The truth lay exposed in black and white, undeniable and irrevocable. Gloria's hand on his shoulder brought him back to the present. You did well, she said simply. The hard part's over. John nodded, not trusting his voice. The hard part, speaking his truth, was indeed finished. What remained was living with the consequences, rebuilding from the foundation up, finding his way forward alone. As he gathered his papers, he caught sight of Melissa in the hallway outside, her face buried in her hands. For a moment, compassion flickered through his pain. Then he remembered the laughter in that transcript, the casual cruelty of betrayal, and he straightened his shoulders. His turn, indeed. The community center's meeting hall buzzed with hushed conversations that died away as John entered. Faces turned toward him, some sympathetic, others merely curious, all aware of why they'd been called together. The board meeting had been scheduled weeks ago, long before John had requested a spot on the agenda, but the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden beams. John's footsteps echoed on the hardwood as he approached the podium, his folder clutched firmly in hands that no longer trembled. 2 months had passed since the courthouse confrontation, and today marked the final piece of his carefully constructed response to betrayal. Gloria had advised against this public reckoning. "The divorce is proceeding in your favor," she'd reminded him. Why risk complicating things? But this wasn't about the divorce anymore. This was about truth in a community where rumors had spread like wildfire, where Melissa's version, poor John losing his grip on reality, had taken root in fertile ground. He placed his notes on the podium and looked out at the assembled board members. Melissa sat among them, her position as volunteer coordinator having survived the initial revelations. She wore the blue dress he'd given her for their anniversary 3 years ago, her face carefully composed despite the paleness of her cheeks. In the back row sat Sarah and Michael, their presence a silent statement of support that warmed John's heart. Robert occupied the chair beside them, nodding encouragement. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," John began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Most of you have known me and my family for decades. You've trusted me to fix your cars, to coach your children, to serve on committees like this one." He paused, gathering himself for what came next. This wasn't the legal proceeding with its clinical presentation of evidence. This was personal, communal, the setting where reputation and legacy lived or died. Recent events in my personal life have become public knowledge, often in distorted forms. Today, I'm here to present the truth. From his folder, John withdrew the first document, a printout of the community center's financial records, sections highlighted in yellow. For the past 18 months, funds from this center's maintenance budget have been diverted, small amounts, carefully hidden in adjusted vendor invoices. John's mechanic's eye, accustomed to spotting the smallest discrepancies, had served him well yet again. These diversions coincide precisely with the hiring of James Kelly as a consultant. A murmur rippled through the audience. James, the architect, the younger man, the lover, had consulted on the center's planned expansion. His name on official documents had given John the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. "The total amount exceeds $40,000, John continued, sliding the document toward the board chair. "I've provided copies of all relevant records, including timestamps of altered entries." Melissa's composure cracked, color draining from her face as she realized the full scope of John's discovery. This wasn't just about personal betrayal anymore. This was professional misconduct, misappropriation of community funds. "The truth out," John declared, his voice rising with emotion for the first time. The words hung in the air, a declaration that went beyond financial impropriety to the heart of what had been stolen from him. Trust, dignity, reputation. Tears gathered in his eyes, but these were different from the broken sobs of discovery or the quiet grief of the courtroom. These tears carried relief, vindication, the release that comes with truth finally and fully revealed. Board members leaned toward each other, whispers becoming urgent consultations. The chair, a retired judge who had known John for 20 years, studied the documents with growing concern. "Mrs. Marshall," she said finally, looking toward Melissa, "these are serious allegations." "Do you wish to respond?" All eyes turned to Melissa, whose hand clutched at her necklace. the nervous habit John had noticed throughout their marriage whenever she felt cornered. There's a misunderstanding, she began, but her usual confidence had evaporated. James advised me the adjustments were standard practice for grant preparation. Grant preparation doesn't require hiding expenditures, the treasurer interjected, already reviewing additional pages John had provided. John watched with strange detachment as the community he'd served for decades rallied around truth and accountability. The evidence he'd gathered spoke for itself, each highlighted entry and annotated date, another brick in the wall of certainty he'd built. From the back of the room, Sarah caught his eye, giving him a small, proud smile. Beside her, Michael nodded solemnly. Their support had been his anchor through the stormy months since discovery, not taking sides initially, then standing firmly with him as evidence mounted. The board chair called for a special session to review all financial records, requesting Melissa remain after the general meeting concluded. The community center portion of the agenda complete, John gathered his remaining documents and stepped away from the podium. As he moved toward the exit, community members approached. A handshake here, a shoulder clasp there, murmured apologies and expressions of support. The tide of public opinion, which had ebbed away under Melissa's carefully constructed narrative, now flowed strongly in his favor. Near the door, he paused, glancing back to where Melissa sat isolated, her earlier supporters having created careful distance. Their eyes met across the room, hers wide with the realization that more than a marriage had ended today. A reputation, a position, perhaps even freedom might be forfeit as investigations proceeded. John felt no triumph in her distress, only a quiet relief that truth had emerged. The man who had spent a lifetime fixing broken things couldn't repair what had shattered between them, but he could ensure the breakage was understood for what it was. As he stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, Sarah and Michael flanked him, their presence a testament to what remained unbroken, family bonds that had weathered the storm. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Sarah said simply, slipping her arm through his. A tear slid down John's weathered cheek, catching the light as it fell. This tear, unlike so many others in recent months, carried no bitterness, only the cleansing release of a burden finally set down. The three of them walked together toward the parking lot, where new beginnings waited beyond the reckoning. The porch swing creaked gently as John pushed against the weathered floorboards with his toe, its rhythmic sound blending with evening crickets and distant wind chimes. 6 months had passed since the community center confrontation. 6 months of rebuilding, restructuring, and slowly reclaiming peace. In his hands rested his father's pocket watch, the gold case worn smooth from generations of thumbs tracing its engravings. The family heirloom had spent recent years in a drawer, forgotten amid the bustle of daily life. Now it served as both connection to his past and symbol of his future, time continuing its measured march regardless of human drama. The last light of day painted the neighborhood in amber hues, casting long shadows across the lawn of the small bungalow he now called home. Not the house where he'd raised his children, not the one filled with 40 years of memories, but a place entirely his own. 2 bedrooms, one for him, one for when the grandchildren visited. A garage workshop where he'd begun restoring vintage radios, a hobby long deferred during his marriage. "You doing all right out here, Dad?" Sarah appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. Sunday dinner at his place had become a new tradition, the family gathering around his table rather than the one Melissa had chosen decades ago. "Just fine, darlin'," he answered, the endearment reclaimed from painful associations. "Just watching the day end." Sarah settled beside him on the swing, its chains protesting slightly at the added weight. "You seem better, more at peace." John nodded, his thumb still moving over the watch's surface. "Getting there." The divorce had finalized 3 months ago, terms heavily favorable to John given the financial misconduct that had come to light. Melissa had moved across state to live with her sister, the relationship with James having collapsed under legal scrutiny. The community center investigation had led to criminal charges still working their way through the system. None of that brought John joy, exactly. There was no pleasure in watching someone he'd once loved face public humiliation and legal consequences, but there was profound relief in vindication, in being believed, in having his experience acknowledged rather than dismissed as an old man's paranoia. "I'm back," he whispered, more to himself than to Sarah. The words crystallized the feeling that had been growing these past weeks, of returning to himself after a long absence. A tear gathered at the corner of his eye, not falling but catching the last golden light of sunset. Unlike the desperate sobs of discovery or the angry tears of betrayal, this moisture came from somewhere deeper, calmer, the quiet acknowledgement of a journey completed. "Michael called earlier," Sarah said, changing the subject with the intuition of a daughter who knew when emotions needed space to breathe. "Emma lost another tooth. Wants to show you next weekend." John smiled, thinking of his 6-year-old granddaughter's gap-toothed grin. "Tell her Grandpa's got a special tooth fairy box almost finished in the workshop." The simple joy of creating something for Emma, the knowledge that he would be present for her childhood, for all his grandchildren's milestones, filled him with quiet contentment. The fear that had haunted him during the worst days, that Melissa's narrative would separate him from his family, had proven unfounded. If anything, the bonds had strengthened through adversity. The watch in his palm ticked steadily, a mechanical heartbeat that had continued through world wars, economic depressions, births, deaths, and now, the dissolution of a marriage once thought permanent. "You know," John said, closing the watch case with a soft click, "your grandmother used to say that some things need to break before they can be properly fixed." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture so reminiscent of her childhood that it briefly transported him across decades. "Is that how you see it? That this needed to happen?" John considered the question, watching a star appear in the deepening blue above them. "Not needed, no. But since it did happen, I've tried to fix what I could. Me, my relationships with you kids, my place in the community. And you have, Dad. You really have." The screen door opened again, Michael emerging with John's youngest grandchild, 3-year-old Lily, perched on his hip. "Someone insists on a porch swing ride with Grandpa before bedtime," he announced. John tucked the watch into his pocket and held out his arms. Lily scrambled onto his lap, her small body fitting perfectly against his chest, her baby-fine hair tickling his chin as she settled in. "Swing, Grandpa," she commanded with the confidence of the deeply loved. As he gently pushed the swing into motion again, John felt the final piece of his healing click into place. The past couldn't be changed, but it didn't dictate his future either. Here, in this moment of simple joy, was everything that mattered: family, purpose, dignity restored. "Higher, Grandpa," Lily giggled, her small hands gripping his forearm. John obliged, increasing the swing's arc slightly as Sarah and Michael shared an amused glance. The motion stirred the evening air, carrying the scent of Sarah's apple pie from the kitchen window and the lingering fragrance of the roses he'd planted along the porch railing. His garden now, his choices. When Lily finally surrendered to her father's insistence on bedtime, John remained on the swing, watching as stars multiplied across the darkening sky. The neighborhood settled into evening quietness, porch lights blinking on one by one. His new neighbor across the street, a widow about his age, waved from her own porch. John raised his hand in return, a simple acknowledgement that might or might not grow into friendship. Time would tell, and he had time now, time that was truly his own. The tear that had gathered earlier finally fell, tracing a path down his weathered cheek. John didn't wipe it away. accepting it as part of the complex emotion of this moment. Grief for what had been lost, gratitude for what remained, hope for what might yet be. "I'm back," he whispered again to the night air, the words a promise to himself. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his pocket, marking the beginning of whatever came next. Folks, we've all sat alone in a quiet room, haven't we? That moment when something shifts under your feet, trust cracking like old floorboards you thought would hold forever. Maybe it wasn't a letter like John found. Maybe it was a whispered phone call, a strange receipt, or just that hollow feeling when someone's story doesn't quite line up. You know that ache, the one that starts behind your ribs and spreads until your whole chest feels like it's caving in. The tears that come aren't just for what's lost, but for what you thought you had all along. Truth is, betrayal cuts deeper when you've weathered decades together. Those aren't just years, they're Christmases and birthdays, illnesses nursed and victories celebrated, grandchildren bounced on tired knees. Each memory now carries a question mark. Was it real? When did it change? Could I have seen it sooner? Your morning coffee tastes different when doubt pours in alongside the cream. The kitchen where you've made thousands of meals suddenly feels foreign, like you're standing in someone else's life. You're not alone in this, darling. The hardest part isn't even the shock. It's what comes after. The moment you have to decide whether to crumble or stand tall. When you look in the mirror and wonder if anyone sees value in the person looking back. But here's what I've learned watching John's journey. There's power in those hands that shake with grief. The same eyes that blur with tears can eventually see with remarkable clarity. The wisdom you've gathered over decades doesn't disappear when someone betrays you. It becomes your compass through the storm. That porch swing where you sit watching stars emerge, it's still yours. The skills that built a life, fixed what was broken, created something from nothing, all still yours. The dignity in choosing truth over comfortable lies belongs to you alone. And those grandchildren who run to you with sticky hands and endless questions, the love there remains unbroken, perhaps even strengthened by your unwavering commitment to honesty. Your story doesn't end with betrayal. The tears dry eventually. The heart, resilient muscle that it is, keeps beating. You find yourself laughing again, hesitantly at first, then with abandon. You plant new gardens, make new friends, perhaps even open yourself to new love, not because you've forgotten, but because you've remembered who you truly are beneath the grief. Trust breaks, hearts mend, and you, my friend, are stronger than you know.